The bells of King's Chapel tolled low across Boston, their iron voices carrying through the streets like a funeral procession that never ended. Margaret Pembroke drew her black veil closer to her face, though there was no burial that day, only her daily ritual of shrouding herself in mourning. She had worn black for 6 years, since the death of her husband Charles, and many whispered she wore it not for grief, but as armor. Her silhouette was known along Beacon Street, the wealthy widow, aloof, elegant, untouchable. The house she returned to was as stern as she was. The Pembroke mansion stood among the row of brownstones, its shutters always drawn, its marble steps always polished, its interior lit just enough to suggest life but never warmth. Margaret moved through its halls like a queen through a decaying court, her hands brushing the polished banisters, her eyes catching on portraits of dead men. Charles Pembroke glared down from the largest canvas in the dining hall, his features as cold as the grave that held him. At the parlor window, Clara and Eliza waited, the daughters she guarded like treasures and pawns. Clara, the elder at 20, was quiet, watchful, her face pale but lovely, her dark hair pinned perfectly. Eliza, 17, was restless, with eyes that shifted quickly and lips that curled in defiance whenever her mother's back was turned. "You are late, Mother," Eliza said softly, though her voice carried a bite. Margaret removed her gloves with deliberate calm, laying them on the silver tray by the door. "I am never late, Eliza. I arrive precisely when I intend." Clara glanced between them, ever the peacemaker. "The Thompsons called earlier. They asked again whether we shall attend the spring ball." Margaret's veil trembled as she lifted it, revealing a face still striking though drawn with years. Her eyes, sharp as cut glass, settled on Clara. "We shall attend, yes, but not to dance. To sit, then," Eliza muttered, "to watch." Margaret's gaze cut to her younger daughter, to be observed, to be evaluated. "A woman's worth is not in her steps, Eliza, but in the alliances she forges. Remember that." Eliza turned away, her fingers twisting the ribbon at her waist. She had heard these sermons before, each word like another stitch binding her to a future she did not choose. That evening the widow hosted guests in her parlor, 3 young men of good standing, invited under the guise of tea and music. The parlor smelled of polished mahogany, and lilies arranged too perfectly. Clara played the piano with delicate precision while Eliza sat nearby, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Margaret watched every moment, every glance exchanged, every slip of expression. Daniel Hale was among the guests, son of a shipping magnate, handsome in the way of men who knew the weight of their father's fortunes. His eyes lingered too long on Clara as she played, though he spoke little. Margaret marked this carefully. The other 2 men, Edward Pratt and Jonathan Lowell, chatted idly of politics, tariffs, and the looming specter of unrest in Washington. Their laughter rang false in the stiff air. When the guests departed, Margaret dismissed her daughters with a look. Only Clara lingered, setting her hand lightly on her mother's chair. "Daniel Hale seems kind," Clara ventured. "Kindness is not currency," Margaret replied. "Remember that." In her chambers later, Margaret unlocked a desk drawer and drew out a leather-bound ledger. Inside, her neat script recorded every name, every asset, every whispered promise of dowry or inheritance. Next to Daniel Hale's name she wrote a small note, observed favoring Clara. She shut the ledger firmly, locking it again. Outside, Boston simmered with change. Irish immigrants crowded the docks, filling the tenements with noise and song, while society women whispered of abolition and men in taverns cursed the shifting tides of politics. Margaret Pembroke cared little for these storms. Her world was her daughters, their marriages, their futures. The Pembroke name would not fade into obscurity, not while she lived, yet even as she plotted, cracks began to show. That night, Eliza crept from her room, slipping into the library with a candle. She searched the shelves until she found the letters her father had kept, hidden behind ledgers of trade. In them she read not of glory or wealth, but of debts, of bribes paid to aldermen, of ships run aground and fortunes lost. Her father had been no Titan but a gambler, and it was her mother who had kept the illusion of grandeur alive. Eliza's candle flickered as she read, her lips curling into a smile both bitter and triumphant. Her mother's power was built on smoke, and she had found the match to burn it down. Meanwhile, across the city, Daniel Hale sat at his father's desk, the faint scent of Clara's perfume still clinging to him. His father spoke of expanding their fleet, of new opportunities in China trade, but Daniel's mind was elsewhere. He thought of the quiet dignity in Clara's eyes, the sharp steel behind Margaret's. He thought of the ledger he had glimpsed when Margaret moved too quickly, a flash of names and numbers he was not meant to see. He wondered what game the widow was truly playing. And in the Pembroke mansion, Margaret sat alone at the window, staring at the darkened streets of Beacon Hill. She lifted her veil once more, holding the black cloth between her fingers like a weapon. The world believed she mourned her husband, but in truth she mourned nothing. Mourning gave her power, mourning gave her mystery, mourning gave her freedom to move in ways society would not forgive a wife. Let them whisper, she thought, let them wonder. I will not bury my ambitions with Charles. The bells of King's Chapel tolled again, slow and relentless, echoing through the night. Margaret Pembroke closed her eyes, and for a moment even she wondered if the sound was mourning or warning. The spring ball at the Thompson estate was the first true unveiling of Boston's season. Carriages lined the narrow streets, their lamps casting golden pools across the brick facades of Beacon Hill. Inside, chandeliers spilled light over satin gowns and black coats, the air heavy with perfume, wine, and the hum of 100 ambitions. Margaret Pembroke entered last, her veil thinner than usual but present, her daughters in silk at her side. Clara's gown was a soft pearl color, modest yet luminous, chosen by her mother to draw the eye without declaring itself. Eliza wore rose silk, though she had argued bitterly against it, claiming it made her look like an ornament. Margaret silenced her with a glance. The Pembroke daughters were not ornaments, she reminded them, they were investments. As the trio crossed the threshold, conversations faltered, heads turned. The widow had a way of shifting a room without speaking, as though her silence commanded more than any voice. She nodded once toward the hostess and moved forward, her eyes already scanning for prey and allies. Daniel Hale was there, as she expected, standing with Edward Pratt near the punch bowl. Daniel's gaze drifted almost immediately to Clara, and Margaret marked the heat in his expression like a strategist noting the enemy's position. Edward, more boisterous, greeted them with exaggerated cheer. Miss Clara, Miss Eliza, Widow Pembroke, a pleasure, a true pleasure. The city feels brighter with your presence. Boston shines well enough on its own. Margaret said coolly, then tilted her head toward Daniel. And Mr. Hale, I trust your father's health improves. Daniel bowed slightly. He is strong as ever, madam. He speaks often of your late husband's wisdom. Margaret smiled faintly, as though Charles had left behind more than debts and disappointments. He was a man of vision. Boston still profits from his foresight. The music struck, violins swelling, and couples gathered to dance. Clara looked to her mother, who inclined her head. Daniel stepped forward, offering his hand. Clara hesitated only a breath before placing her gloved fingers in his. Eliza scowled, her own dance partner, a lanky Lowell cousin, fumbling at her side. As Clara and Daniel joined the waltz, the world seemed to recede. Daniel guided her with a steadiness she found both surprising and comforting. Your mother frightens me, he admitted quietly as they turned. She frightens most people, Clara said, a shadow of a smile touching her lips. And you, Clara's gaze lifted to his, I obey her. Daniel's hand tightened ever so slightly at her waist. Obedience and fear are not the same. You deserve more than her strategies. Clara faltered, her steps nearly breaking, but Daniel steadied her. Across the room, Margaret watched, her eyes narrow but unreadable. Later, when the dance ended, Clara retreated with Eliza to a side corridor lined with portraits of dour ancestors. Eliza wasted no time. "You like him," she accused, her voice sharp. Clara lowered her gaze. "He is kind. Kindness is weakness." Eliza spat. "Mother will never allow it unless it profits her." "And what would you allow?" Clara asked softly. Eliza's expression shifted, her defiance tinged with something darker. "I would allow myself to live, not to sit waiting while she trades us like stocks." Their conversation ended as Margaret appeared, sweeping down the corridor like a shadow. "Clara," she said, her tone even, "you will accompany Mr. Hale to supper next week. His family has extended a private invitation." Eliza opened her mouth, but Margaret's eyes silenced her. Clara nodded dutifully. That night, after the ball, Margaret sat again at her desk, her ledger open. She wrote beside Daniel's name, "Secured private supper." Next to Edward Pratt she added, "Too eager, lacks discretion." Her pen moved with certainty until she heard the faintest creak. Eliza at the door, watching. "You should be in bed," Margaret said without turning, "and you should stop pretending father left you anything worth scheming over." Eliza replied, her voice low and dangerous, "I've read his letters." The pen froze in Margaret's hand. Slowly she turned, her face still but her eyes burning. "You know nothing, child." "I know enough," Eliza said, "enough to see that all your power is borrowed, that ledger is nothing but ink. Without us, you are nothing." For a moment, silence filled the room, thick and suffocating. Then Margaret rose, her black silk rustling like wings. She crossed the space between them in measured steps, stopping so close that Eliza could feel her mother's breath. "Without me," Margaret whispered, "you would be nothing. I built this house from ashes. I held it together while your father drowned us in ruin. You think knowledge makes you powerful. Knowledge without control is a noose, Eliza. Be careful how tightly you pull it." Eliza did not flinch, though her hands trembled at her sides. She turned and left without another word. Across the city, Daniel Hale lay awake in his chamber. He had excused himself from the ball early, unsettled by Margaret's stare and Clara's quiet sorrow. His thoughts returned to the ledger, that flicker of parchment and ink in Margaret's hand, and the way her eyes measured every move. He rose from bed and lit a candle, pulling out his own father's shipping records. What he saw made his blood chill, transactions signed not only by Hale but by Pembroke as well. The two families' fortunes were tangled, their ships co-owned, their debts interlaced. Daniel leaned back, the candlelight painting shadows across his face. If Margaret controlled these accounts, then she controlled his family more than his father admitted. And if Clara was part of her plan, then his own heart was nothing more than another figure in her ledger. He closed the book sharply, extinguished the candle, and lay in darkness. But the thought refused to leave him. Margaret Pembroke was not a grieving widow. She was a chess master, and he had already stepped onto her board. The morning fog along Boston Harbor rolled in thick, swallowing the masts of ships until they rose like ghostly spears against the gray sky. From the high windows of the Pembroke mansion, the fog looked harmless, picturesque. But in the alleys of the North End, it mixed with the smoke of cooking fires, the damp stink of tenements, and the cries of children chasing each other barefoot across cobblestones slick with fish guts. Clara had never been to that quarter before. Her mother would never have allowed it. But curiosity, or perhaps rebellion born quietly in her chest, brought her there. It was not entirely accident she had followed the sound of a voice she had first heard through the printed word. The Boston Sentinel, a small paper passed discreetly among some of the servants, had published an article that Clara had stumbled upon weeks earlier. It condemned the hypocrisy of Boston's elites, the same men who profited from shipping while denouncing the Irish workers unloading their cargoes. The piece had been sharp, cutting, with a wit that lingered in Clara's mind. The name beneath it was Aidan O'Connell. Now, as she stepped hesitantly into a crowded street near Hanover, she heard that same voice lifted above the din. A young man stood on a crate, newspaper clutched in his hand, reading aloud to a small crowd. His hair was dark and unruly, his coat threadbare, but his words rang with conviction. They say we are unworthy, that we bring disease, idleness, ruin. Yet it is our backs that carry their cargo, our sweat that fuels their profit, our lives spent building their city, while they call us parasites. Some in the crowd jeered in agreement, others clapped, but Clara stood frozen, caught by the fire in his eyes. This was Aidan O'Connell. When the gathering broke apart under the watchful glare of a constable, Clara found herself lingering. Aidan stepped down from the crate, tucking his papers under his arm. His gaze met hers unexpectedly, and for a moment he looked startled, her silk cloak and gloved hands marking her clearly as a woman far removed from his world. "You've lost your way, miss?" he asked, his brogue softened by years in America but unmistakable. Clara's lips parted, then closed again. "No, I wish to hear. His brow furrowed, then smoothed with something like amusement. "A lady from Beacon Hill, listening to the troubles of the Irish. I'd not have guessed it." "I read your words," Clara said quickly, almost breathless. "In the Sentinel. They moved me." Aidan studied her more carefully now. He saw the fear in her eyes, but also something else, hunger, not for food but for truth. He tipped his head slightly. "Then you know more than most of your kind. Still, it's not safe for you here. You should go back before you're seen." But Clara did not move. "Will you write again?" His smile was faint, cautious. "Aye, until they silence me." That evening, Clara returned home with mud on her hem, and her pulse quickened with something she could not name. She slipped into the parlor where Eliza sat embroidering without enthusiasm. "You've been out," Eliza said, eyeing the mud. "Yes." Clara hesitated, then lowered her voice. "I met him." "Who?" "The writer, Aidan O'Connell." Eliza's needle stilled. She turned, her expression sharp. "You went to the North End?" Clara nodded, a flush rising to her cheeks. Eliza's mouth curved into a dangerous smile. "Mother would be furious. She mustn't know." "She will," Eliza said. "She always does." And indeed, Margaret noticed. At supper, she remarked on Clara's cloak, still faintly damp. "You went walking without the carriage." Clara kept her voice steady. The weather was fair. Margaret's eyes lingered a moment too long, but she let the matter drop. Yet later, when she wrote in her ledger, she added no new notes beside Daniel Hale's name. Instead, she underlined Clara's name twice, her pen biting into the page. Across the city, Aidan O'Connell sat in a cramped room above a tavern, his pen scratching furiously. He wrote not of politics this time, but of the woman in silk who had stood among fishmongers and laborers, her eyes wide, unafraid. He cursed himself for the distraction, yet her image lingered like a ghost in his mind. Days later, fate conspired to draw them together again. Clara, sent by Margaret to deliver a message to the church about a charity fund, detoured through the common. There, on a bench beneath budding elms, she found Aidan with a notebook on his knee. "You," he said, surprised, "you should not be here." "And yet I am," Clara replied, more boldly this time. They spoke then, cautiously at first, then with a freedom Clara had never known. He spoke of his family in Cork, of the famine that had driven them to America, of the prejudice that met them at every step. She listened, not out of pity, but with an eagerness that startled even her. "And you," he asked finally, "what do you seek, Clara Pembroke, daughter of Beacon Hill?" She looked out at the Swan Pond, its waters rippling gold in the late sun. "I seek to be seen, not as currency, not as my mother's ambition, simply as myself." Aidan's gaze softened, and in that moment Clara felt something shift inside her, fragile yet undeniable. But shadows lengthened even in the brightest hours. Eliza, restless and cunning, followed her sister days later, confirming her suspicions. From the shelter of trees, she watched Clara sit with Aidan, their heads bent close in quiet conversation. Her smile was bitter. At supper that evening, Eliza toyed with her wine and remarked casually, "Mother, Did you know Clara has taken to strolling in the common?" Margaret's fork stilled. "Has she?" "Yes, she meets a man there." Eliza's eyes flicked briefly to Clara, not Daniel Hale. The silence that followed was sharper than glass. Clara's heart thudded painfully, her face burning. Margaret's gaze settled on her with the weight of iron. "We will speak later," she said simply, and speak they did. In Margaret's chamber, lit by a single oil lamp, the widow's fury was not loud but cold. "Do you understand what you risk?" she demanded. "Do you comprehend what ruin you invite upon yourself and upon this family?" Clara, trembling, lifted her chin. "I understand only that I am alive, and that he sees me." Margaret's hand struck the table, rattling the lamp. "He is nothing. A scribbler, a foreigner, a danger to everything we are." Clara's voice broke, but did not falter. "Perhaps what we are is not worth preserving." For a moment Margaret said nothing. Then she leaned close, her veil brushing Clara's cheek. "You are mine," she whispered, "and you will not betray me for a gutter-born dreamer. I will not allow it." But even as she spoke, Clara's heart rebelled. For the first time, she understood that her mother's power was not infinite. It ended where her own will began, and somewhere in the city, Aidan O'Connell folded his newest article, the ink still drying, and smiled faintly to himself. The widow of Beacon Hill might command society, but she would not command the heart of Clara Pembroke. The rain came hard over Boston, streaking down the tall windows of the Pembroke mansion, drumming against the roof like the beat of war drums. Margaret Pembroke stood in the drawing room, veil lifted, her hand resting on the mantel as she listened to the storm. The city beyond was shifting, restive. She could feel it in the mutter of voices on the street, in the sharper tone of the newspapers, in the way men looked at her daughters as though calculating not just beauty but rebellion. Clara and Eliza sat together on the settee, the air between them tense. Clara's eyes were lowered over a book, though she had not turned a page in some time. Eliza, restless, tapped her fingers against the armrest, her lips twitching with unsaid words. At last Eliza broke the silence. "Mother, the ball at the Lowell estate is next week. Will we attend?" Margaret turned from the window. "Yes. Appearances must be kept. Rumors already circle like vultures." Eliza smirked. "Rumors of what?" "That Clara slips away to meet her Irish poet in the common." Clara's head snapped up, her face flushing. "Eliza, enough." Margaret's voice cut like a blade. She moved forward, her presence filling the room. "Your tongues are as dangerous as your actions. Do you not understand? Society waits for us to stumble. Every whisper, every careless glance, it feeds the wolves at our door." "But wolves," Eliza said sweetly, "do not bow to widows forever." Margaret's eyes locked on her younger daughter, and for a moment the storm outside seemed to falter. Then she turned away, unwilling to grant Eliza the satisfaction of further anger. That same week, the whispers grew louder. Servants spoke in corners of seeing Clara in the common. A note, unsigned, appeared at Margaret's doorstep warning of unseemly company. At a dinner on Beacon Street, an alderman's wife leaned too close to Margaret and said, "Your daughters are beautiful. I do hope they remember their place." The tone was sugar, the meaning venom. Margaret returned home with fury simmering under her calm exterior. In her chamber, she unlocked her ledger and stared at the names, the columns, the careful plans she had built. Daniel Hale's name glowed brightest, steady, wealthy, respectable. If Clara could be bound to him, the rumors might die, the wolves might retreat. But Clara's heart threatened all of it. Daniel himself was restless. He sat in the library of his family home, poring over records, tracing the ties between the Hale fleet and the Pembroke holdings. The deeper he looked, the more tangled the accounts became. Margaret's hand was everywhere, securing debts, leveraging ships, ensuring her influence reached into his own household. He remembered the look in her eyes at the Thompson ball, the way she measured him as if he were not a man but a move on her board. "Daniel," his father said one evening, appearing at the door, "you've grown pale with those papers. What troubles you?" Daniel shut the ledger quickly. "Nothing, father, "Only business, business," his father echoed, sighing. "Remember, the Pembrokes are valuable allies. Do not squander what your marriage might secure." Daniel stiffened. "Marriage? Margaret will press for it. Clara is a fine girl, sweet, biddable. You could do worse." Daniel said nothing. Sweet, biddable, was that how her mother saw her, or was Clara something more, something Margaret feared? Meanwhile, Eliza was scheming. She had grown tired of waiting under her mother's shadow, tired of watching Clara draw eyes and sympathy while she herself simmered. She found her way into Jonathan Lowell's company, the same awkward young man who had stumbled through a dance at the ball. He was pliable, desperate for favor, and above all, willing to listen. "They say my sister is in love," Eliza told him one evening, her tone conspiratorial. "With a man unfit for her." Jonathan leaned closer, his breath sour with wine. "Who, an Irishman, a writer, imagined the scandal?" Jonathan's eyes widened, delight sparking. "Does society know?" "Not yet," Eliza whispered. "But secrets have a way of spreading." And so they did. Within days, the rumor leapt from mouth to mouth, whispered in the parlors of Beacon Hill, carried by servants down to the markets. Clara Pembroke and an Irish radical. Margaret's careful edifice trembled. She summoned Clara to her chamber, the veil cast aside to reveal the steel in her face. "You have brought shame upon us," she said coldly. Clara stood tall, though her hands shook. "I have brought truth. I will not apologize for love." "Love?" Margaret spat. "Do you think love will shield you from ruin, from ridicule, from exile, from every parlor, every drawing room that keeps us alive?" Clara's voice broke but held. "Perhaps I no longer wish to live in drawing rooms." Margaret's breath hissed between her teeth. "Then you are a fool, and I will not allow fools under my roof." But she did not cast Clara out. Not yet. She could not afford it, not while Daniel Hale lingered uncertain, not while debts pressed closer. Instead, she tightened her watch, forbidding Clara to leave without escort, assigning servants to shadow her steps. Yet the heart is a wild thing. One rain, slick evening, Clara slipped free, her cloak drawn tight, and met Aidan beneath the elm trees of the common. The city was hushed, the lamps flickering. He took her hands, cold and trembling, into his own. "They will destroy you," he said. "They cannot," she whispered. "Not if I choose differently, not if I choose you." He kissed her then, the rain washing over them, the world beyond forgotten. For the first time in her life, Clara felt alive, unshackled, her mother's voice silenced by the roar of her own heart. But unseen in the shadows, a figure lingered. Eliza. She had followed, her cloak blending with the night. Her eyes glittered with something between envy and triumph. She turned and walked away, knowing exactly what to do with what she had witnessed. The storm broke harder over the city. In Beacon Hill mansions, whispers became knives. At the Hale estate, Daniel Reed, an anonymous letter slipped under his door. The words stark: "Clara Pembroke betrays you with an Irish agitator." He stared at the ink until it blurred, his chest tight with fury and confusion. Was it true, or another move in Margaret's game? Either way, he knew one thing: the storm was not only coming, it had already begun. And in her chamber, Margaret sat with her veil once more lowered, listening to the rain and the distant toll of bells. She closed her ledger, her fingers trembling not from weakness but from rage. The city was watching, the wolves circling. She had fought too long, clawed too far, to let her daughters destroy her. If she had to, she would fight them as fiercely as any rival. The storm outside raged, but it was nothing compared to the one gathering within the Pembroke house. The Lowell estate glittered with gold that night, every chandelier ablaze, every mirror reflecting silk and diamonds until the entire hall seemed aflame. The ball was the season's crown jewel, where Boston's elite gathered not merely to dance, but to be seen, judged, measured, and remembered. The Lowell name had stood for wealth since the mills rose on the Merrimack, and tonight their Beacon Hill mansion seemed a temple to that power. Margaret Pembroke arrived with her daughters on either arm. the image of composure draped in black silk. Her veil was thinner than usual, revealing her sharp cheekbones and sharper eyes. Clara, pale but radiant, wore ivory trimmed with pearls. Eliza in emerald satin glittered like envy itself. The three entered to a hush, as if the room itself bent to acknowledge the widow and her heirs. But beneath the hush, whispers coiled. Clara with an Irishman. A scandal brewing, the widow losing her grip. Margaret felt them as keenly as a draught through broken glass. Still, her back remained straight, her smile faint and deadly. Let them whisper. Tonight she would silence them. Daniel Hale approached first, his face schooled into calm but his eyes betraying storm. He bowed, greeting Margaret with measured civility, then offered Clara his hand. "Will you dance?" Clara hesitated, her gaze flicking briefly to her mother. Margaret inclined her head with imperceptible authority. Clara placed her hand in Daniel's, her fingers trembling. The music swelled a waltz, elegant and relentless. Daniel guided Clara expertly, but his words were sharp. "Tell me it isn't true." Clara's breath caught. "What have you heard? That you disgrace yourself, that you shame your family, that you consort with an Irish agitator in the Common." His grip tightened at her waist, not cruel but desperate. "Tell me it isn't true." Clara lifted her chin. "If I tell you it is, what then?" Daniel faltered, nearly missing a step. Then you condemn yourself." "No." Clara whispered, her voice steady. "I free myself." The dance carried them in circles, her words echoing in his mind until the music ended and he released her, his face pale. Margaret watched from across the room, every muscle in her body coiled. She had seen the exchange, the distance that grew between them. Her plan unraveled with every turn of Clara's defiance. Meanwhile, Eliza moved like a serpent through the crowd. She had whispered enough to Jonathan Lowell to ensure the rumor now spread like spilled wine. Laughter hushed as clusters of guests bent heads together, eyes flicking toward Clara. Eliza smiled, sipping her wine, her satisfaction as sweet as it was poisonous. It happened swiftly, too swiftly for Margaret to intercept. A letter, folded neatly, slipped from hand to hand until it found its way into the grasp of Edward Pratt, who could never resist an audience. Standing near the orchestra, he opened it and read aloud with theatrical flourish, his voice slicing through the music. "It is known by many that Clara Pembroke, daughter of the widow, meets secretly with an Irish radical, Aidan O'Connell, in the Common. Let the truth be judged by those who value purity and propriety." The room froze. Gasps erupted, fans fluttered, eyes darted. Clara's face burned crimson, her lips parting in shock. Margaret moved instantly, sweeping forward like a storm cloud, her hand seizing the letter from Edward's grasp. "How dare you," she hissed, her voice low but venomous, "to spread lies under my roof?" But the damage was done. Every ear had heard, every tongue was already shaping the story. Clara stood trembling, then found her voice. "It is no lie." A collective intake of breath swept the room. Margaret turned slowly, her eyes wide with fury. "Clara?" She whispered the name like a curse. Clara raised her head, her voice quivering but clear. "Yes, I love him, and I will not deny it, not even here." The silence shattered. Women gasped, men muttered. The orchestra faltered to a stop. The Lowell matron herself turned pale with scandal at such a declaration in her house. Daniel Hale stepped forward, his face stricken. "Clara, you cannot." "I can." Clara said. Tears brimmed in her eyes, but her resolve burned. "I will." Margaret's hand shot out, gripping Clara's arm so tightly that her knuckles blanched. "Enough," she hissed. "You will hold your tongue." But Clara pulled free, her voice rising. "No more silence, no more ledgers and bargains. I will not be sold as you sold yourself to power." The words rang across the hall like a shot. Gasps turned to murmurs, murmurs to scandalous laughter. Eliza's eyes gleamed, triumphant at last. Margaret stood rigid, her composure cracked, her mask shattered before all of Boston's elite. She forced a smile, brittle as glass. "My daughter is unwell. The strain has unsettled her, but no one believed it. The damage was irreparable. Clara fled the room, skirts trailing, tears streaking her face. Daniel followed, torn between anger and pity. Eliza lingered, basking in the chaos she had sown. Margaret remained frozen in place, every whisper a dagger, every glance a wound. When the ball finally ended, the Pembroke carriage carried them home in silence. Clara sat rigid, staring out the window, her jaw set. Eliza reclined smugly, her fan fluttering lazily. Margaret's hands were folded tightly in her lap, her nails biting into her palms through her gloves. At last she spoke, her voice low, trembling not with weakness but with rage. "You have destroyed us." Clara turned, her eyes fierce despite the tears. "No, mother, you destroyed yourself. I only revealed it." The carriage rattled on through the storm, slick streets, Beacon Hill looming ahead like a fortress under siege. Inside, the Pembroke family sat in silence, each locked in their own victory, their own ruin. And above the city, the church bells tolled midnight, heavy and unrelenting, as if marking the death of something greater than one family's reputation. The morning after the Lowell ball dawned gray and heavy, the city cloaked in the kind of fog that clung to the harbor like morning crepe. Margaret Pembroke rose before the sun, her body stiff, her mind taut with the residue of humiliation. Sleep had eluded her, chased away by the whispers that surely still swirled through parlors and drawing rooms across Beacon Hill. Boston never forgot scandal. It clung, it festered, it destroyed. She sat at her writing desk, quill poised above a ledger. The numbers blurred before her eyes, columns of investments stacked like soldiers waiting to betray her. Her shipping contracts, her stake in cotton imports, her discreet loans to the Lowell mills, all of it, all the fragile scaffolding of her power balanced on reputation. Without it, the paper empire she had built would collapse with the first gust of doubt. From the street below, a faint clamor rose, shouts, hurried footsteps, the crack of hooves. Margaret set down her quill and moved to the window. The fog glowed faintly orange to the east, a sickly halo. Then came the unmistakable tolling of alarm bells. A fire, the thought landed heavy. Fires were common enough in Boston's cramped districts, but this glow was too close, too fierce. She snatched her shawl and descended the stairs. Clara and Eliza lingered in the parlor, their silence sharp and brittle. Eliza looked up with false sweetness. "Another storm, mother." But Margaret ignored her, pushing out into the chill morning air. Neighbors gathered in their nightclothes, faces pale, pointing toward the harbor. The smoke was rising in thick plumes, curling black against the fog. The docks were burning. Margaret's heart seized. The docks were her lifeblood. She hurried down Beacon Street, carriages rattling past, men shouting for buckets, fire brigades clanging through the narrow roads. As she reached the hill's base, the acrid stench hit her, tar, timber, salt, and smoke all commingling into a choking miasma. The wharves were chaos. Flames leapt from warehouse to warehouse, devouring wood and rope and canvas with greedy hunger. Men shouted as they formed bucket lines, their silhouettes black against the inferno. Sparks whirled through the air like malevolent fireflies, alighting on nearby rooftops. And there, amid the screaming fire, Margaret saw the sigil burned into her soul, the Pembroke shipping banner, curling and blackening as the flames consumed it. "No," she whispered, stepping forward as if sheer will could douse the blaze. A man grasped her arm, pulling her back. It was Jonathan Lowell, his face grim and soot-streaked. "You shouldn't be here, it's too dangerous. My warehouses, they're gone," he said flatly. "Yours, Pratt's, half of the Hale stock as well. The fire took them before the brigade even arrived." Margaret's breath left her body in a hollow gasp. Gone. Everything she had wagered, everything she had clawed and schemed to build. "Insurance," she began. Jonathan's eyes softened with something almost like pity. "Do you think underwriters will honor policies when half the city whispers of scandal in your house? They'll call it negligence. They'll call it divine punishment if it suits them." Margaret staggered, clutching the railing of the nearest post. Around her, men fought the blaze, their shouts rising above the crackle and roar. The firelight cast their faces in stark relief, making every figure seem both heroic and damned. Through the smoke, she glimpsed another figure, Daniel Hale, shouting orders, his sleeves rolled, his face streaked with ash. His eyes found hers for a fleeting instant. He did not bow, did not call out, did not acknowledge. Then he turned away, back to the fire, as if she were already consigned to ashes. Margaret stumbled home hours later, her gown scorched with soot, her veil heavy with smoke. Clara met her at the door, her expression caught between concern and defiance. "The fire destroyed everything," Margaret said hoarsely. She collapsed into a chair, her hands shaking for the first time in decades. The warehouses, the ships, the cargo, all gone. Clara knelt beside her, touching her sleeve gently. "Then it is over. Release it, Mother. Release us." Margaret jerked away, fire in her eyes even as smoke clung to her skin. "Over? Do you think I will crawl into the grave because of one night's whispers and one morning's flames? No, I will rebuild. I will claw my way back if it costs my soul." But even as she said it, the walls seemed to mock her. The house itself felt brittle, too large, too hollow. Servants moved quietly, exchanging looks that bordered on pity. Outside, the bells still tolled as if marking the death of an empire. That evening, Eliza entered her mother's chamber uninvited, her green gown gleaming in the firelight. She leaned casually against the mantel, her smile cold. "So," she said, "your fortune burns with the docks, and Clara disgraces you before society. It seems the Pembroke name has finally caught up with itself." Margaret rose slowly, her shadow stretching tall against the wall. "You will watch your tongue, child." But Eliza only tilted her head, unafraid. "No, Mother, you will, because now the power is gone, the fear is gone, and all that remains is you, a widow with nothing but a ruined name and two daughters who no longer bend to your will." The silence that followed was deeper than any flame's roar. Margaret's hand trembled, not from weakness but from the terrifying knowledge that Eliza spoke truth. That night, Clara slipped from the house, meeting Aidan O'Connell in the shadows of the common. Their embrace was desperate, defiant, the flames of the harbor reflected still in their eyes. "We must leave," he urged. "Boston will devour you now." Clara pressed her forehead to his chest, then let it, "So long as I leave on my own terms." At Beacon Hill, Eliza watched from her window as Clara disappeared into the fog with her Irish lover. She said nothing, made no attempt to stop her. Perhaps part of her admired the courage, perhaps another part delighted in the final fracture. Margaret, alone in her room, sat before the darkened window, the last wisps of smoke still rising from the harbor in the distance. Her ledger lay open, blank now, a relic of a past undone. The inkpot sat untouched. She had no more numbers to conjure, no more bargains to make. For the first time since her husband's death, she felt the weight of silence, not the heavy, commanding silence of control, but the hollow silence of defeat. She pressed her palms together, her lips moving in a prayer she had not uttered in years, though she could not have said whether it was to God or to the ghost of her own ambition. Outside, Boston's bells tolled again, deep and relentless. Fire and ashes, ruin and rebirth. The city would endure, but Margaret Pembroke's reign had ended in smoke. Snow fell that winter in Boston with a quiet relentlessness, covering the crooked streets and brownstone steps in a white so pure it mocked the soot that still lingered by the harbor. The city carried on, carriages rattling along Beacon Street, church bells marking each hour, society bustling with new scandals to replace the old. But for Margaret Pembroke, the world had narrowed to the walls of her mansion, each room colder and emptier than the last. The fire at the docks had not only consumed her warehouses, but her credibility. Investors withdrew, creditors circled, even the servants began to disappear one by one, their wages unpaid. The house that once hosted soirees and hushed conspiracies now echoed with silence. Dust gathered on the grand stair, the silver sat tarnished on the dining table, and the great chandeliers hung unlit, their crystals dull in the gray winter light. Margaret moved through it like a wraith. Her black gowns had grown threadbare, her veil frayed. She no longer received callers. Those who once courted her favor now crossed the street rather than acknowledge her. In parlors and drawing rooms, the Pembroke name was spoken only as a cautionary tale, the widow who schemed too boldly, who flew too near the sun and tumbled into ruin. Clara was gone. Rumors said she had fled to New York with her Irishman, that she wrote for abolitionist papers under another name, that she was married in secret and expecting a child. Margaret could not know what was true, for Clara's letters never came. The silence was worse than betrayal, a wound that would not close. Eliza remained, but not in loyalty. She had moved into the Lowell household as a guest, some whispered as Jonathan's intended. She visited rarely, and when she did, it was not to comfort but to gloat, her words dripping with honeyed venom. "You see, mother," she had said on her last visit, standing tall in a gown of emerald velvet, "one need not burn to rise from the ashes. One need only step aside at the right moment." Margaret had said nothing. Her tongue, once so sharp, felt heavy now, her words crumbling into ash before they reached her lips. One evening, as the snow fell thick and the city lights blurred through frost on the window, Margaret lit a single candle in the parlor. The flame flickered weakly, casting long shadows on the high ceilings. She sat in her husband's old armchair, her fingers tracing the worn leather. Around her, the portraits of ancestors stared down, solemn men, elegant women, all of them judging, all of them fading into irrelevance as surely as she was. A knock came at the door. She startled, the sound foreign in its rarity. She rose slowly, her joints stiff, and opened the door to find Daniel Hale on the steps, his face lined with care, his coat dusted with snow. "Mrs. Pembroke," he said, bowing slightly. She studied him, her heart stirring with an old, familiar ache, not love, but the memory of what might have been if her life had been different, if she had chosen differently. "Mr. Hale," she replied, her voice rasped with disuse. "Why have you come?" "To offer help," he said simply. "You need not remain here alone." She laughed then, softly, bitterly. "Help from you, after your silence as the city consumed me?" Daniel's jaw tightened. "I spoke when I could, but your pride was always a wall none could scale. Still I would not see you perish in this house." Margaret's eyes glimmered with a tear. She quickly blinked away. "Then see me as I am, a widow stripped of fortune, abandoned by her daughters, forgotten by her peers. This house is my coffin, Mr. Hale, and I have chosen to lie in it." Daniel studied her a long moment, then bowed his head. "Very well." He left without another word, his footsteps fading into the snow. Margaret closed the door and leaned against it, her body trembling with the effort. She returned to the chair, to the candle, to the silence. The flame sputtered, throwing shadows that seemed to dance like ghosts along the walls. She thought of Clara's defiance, of Eliza's cold triumph, of the fire that had stolen her fortune, of the ball where her control had shattered in a single breath. All of it swirled together in her mind until she could no longer tell whether she had lost her daughters to their will or her own. The clock on the mantel struck midnight, its chimes echoing through the empty house. Margaret folded her hands in her lap, her head bowing at last, the veil falling forward like a curtain. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing Beacon Hill in silence, covering cobblestone and rooftop alike. The city lived on, loud, brash, and merciless, but within the Pembroke house, time seemed to halt, leaving only the widow alone with her shadows. And as the candle guttered, casting one final flicker of light before surrendering to the dark, Margaret Pembroke became what she had always feared most, forgotten. This was just one tale in the ritual of fear. Subscribe now, watch again, and face the next story with me.